If it's Wednesday, it's a tale of two emergencies after President Biden and top congressional leaders fail to strike a deal on raising the debt limit, and a record number of migrants are apprehended at the border as Title 42 restrictions expire tomorrow. Plus, the former president's friends and foes react after a jury finds him liable for sexual abuse and defamation as the Republican presidential frontrunner faces a deepening web of legal issues. And chaos at the courthouse as Congressman George Santos is arrested and arraigned in federal court after being criminally charged with wire fraud, money laundering, and stealing public funds. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker on another busy day here in Washington as the White House contends with two crises. One, the standoff with Congress over raising the debt limit after yesterday's talks between the president and congressional leaders got heated and went nowhere. The other crisis is at the border as government agencies scramble to respond to a surge of migrants with pandemic-era restrictions set to expire tomorrow at midnight. Border officials are being pushed to the breaking point. NBC News was the first to report that because of the volume of migrants, Customs and Border Protection officials will be directed by the Biden administration to release some migrants into the U.S. with no way to track them. More than 11,000 migrants were apprehended yesterday. It's a single-day record, already surpassing the administration's predictions of 10,000 apprehensions a day when the Title 42 restrictions actually lift. It comes even as U.S. troops arrive at the southern border to assist with the surge. Speaking today, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas urged migrants not to make the dangerous journey while blaming Congress for the nation's broken immigration system.
I cannot overemphasize that our current situation is the outcome of Congress leaving a broken, outdated immigration system in place for over 2 decades, despite unanimous agreement that we desperately need legislative reform. It is also the result of Congress's decision not to provide us with the resources we need and that we requested.
And while the White House is preparing for the end of Title 42 tomorrow, it's also trying to navigate an intensifying impasse with House Republicans over raising the debt limit. Neither side seemed to budge in yesterday's Oval Office meeting, which a source described as tense and serious.
Everybody in this meeting reiterated the positions they were at. I didn't see any new movement.
Now, as the president prepares to meet again with McCarthy on Friday, this afternoon in New York, he stressed the urgency of the moment and tried to turn up the heat on Republicans.
They're literally, not figuratively, holding the economy hostage by threatening to default on our nation's debt that we've already incurred over the last couple hundred years, unless we give in to their threats and demands as to what they think we should be doing with regard to the budget. This would be incredibly damaging.
I'm joined now by two of my NBC News colleagues, CNBC's senior White House correspondent Kayla Tausche and Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale. Thanks to both of you for being here, for all of your great reporting at all hours of the day and night around this. Kayla, let me start with you. We just talked about the fact that President Biden is in a New York swing district today, one that was actually flipped by a Republican in the midterms after he won it in 2020. What was his message on the economy today to lift the debt limit?
Well, some might be surprised, Kristen, to hear that the president's message was exactly the same as it was last week before that meeting with the top 4 congressional leaders took place just yesterday, even though they sat down with their chiefs of staff for more than an hour yesterday, and their staffs have followed up since then in lengthy conversations about what will come next. President Biden really didn't budge off the stump speech where he was blaming Republicans for holding the economy hostage, for introducing some dangerous scenarios and not taking default off the table. Interestingly, President Biden himself and the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell yesterday both said that the U.S. would not default under any circumstance, but House Speaker Kevin McCarthy did not say that, which is why you're seeing President Biden attack him on that front. But the challenge, Kristen, of course, is what's going to happen behind the scenes, what the Office of Legislative Affairs and the congressional offices of those 4 leaders can actually identify as middle ground going forward, because they're trying to find trillions billions of dollars in cost savings that will satisfy Republicans through the spending process. And certainly what the Biden administration has offered up so far is just tens of billions of dollars. So there's a long way to go, and there's a very short time frame to do it. And the president's public message, at least, is still very disciplined.
You're absolutely right. And the public messaging coming from both sides has been so fascinating. Allie, you had a chance to question Speaker McCarthy yesterday. He came out swinging from that meeting. Didn't seem like there was any real progress. What were your takeaways from the meeting, Allie, and what are your sources telling you today about any potential baby steps that may be made behind the scenes with the staffers who huddled today?
Yeah, Kristen, because it doesn't sound like the core 4 congressional members paired with the president made much progress in the room. It sounds like, from what our sources told us yesterday, and from the readouts that we got from both the speaker, the president, and the Senate minority leader, that everyone was really dug in their positions. In fact, the readouts that we got from our sources in the room made this meeting sound pretty acrimonious. We heard President Biden come out of it saying that McCarthy was pretty angry during that meeting. Our other sources described this as tense. Others told you and I that McCarthy was, in their words, disrespectful of the president. And we know that there was one word that came up that really, I think, speaks to the larger tone and tenor here, which is the L word, the idea of a lie. McCarthy told me when he got back to this building that he called out a lie to the face of the president, in that he thinks that talking about the cuts that could be made to veterans in the spending cuts that Republicans are trying to make, McCarthy thinks that that's not true, and he came at the president over that. The president confirmed that. I asked McCarthy to his face, well, did you call the president a liar? He said he didn't go that far. But nevertheless, when you hear such a charged word like that being used in these rooms where, in theory, we're supposed to see productive negotiations, it doesn't necessarily lend to any optimism around this. I think what is a silver lining here is the fact that even as the principals remained in their postures, we do have staff continuing to meet. Today, they met for a few hours here at the Capitol. They'll continue meeting tomorrow. And then, of course, we know that everyone will be back at the table on Friday with the president. But the fact that they're still having these conversations behind the scenes is really the only good news and the only small step of progress that we could see. But again, they're on a very tight timeline here, and that's not exactly the kind of mood that you want to get, especially out of someone like the president, who really does value the personal side of negotiating relationships.
Yeah, that's for sure. Allie, I have to give you props for asking Speaker McCarthy directly what happened in that meeting.
The benefit of our text chains.
Yes, exactly. You got an answer. It was very impressive. And Kayla, you had some really great interviews with voters. What are people telling you about who they are going to blame if this does, in fact, become the worst case scenario, if the country does go over the fiscal cliff? And what are their biggest concerns, Kayla?
Well, Kristen, earlier this week I was in Michigan. It's a critical battleground state for President Biden. He won it in 2020 by a very slim margin. And I was just there a couple days ago, and the voters we spoke with said ultimately, if this is taken to or beyond the brink, that the buck stops with President Biden. He is the commander in chief, and they ultimately will hold him responsible if the country approaches or ends up undergoing a default. Now, that's not how the White House sees it. The entire White House strategy is predicated on voters blaming Republicans for whatever happens if there is some dire economic scenario that follows. And even yesterday, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy was asked if he would bear any responsibility if that ends up happening, and he simply washed his hands of it and said no. House Republicans passed their spending bill. They passed it, that the Senate would have taken it up if they had the support for it, and that ultimately House Republicans did their job, that they would not bear responsibility for that. But we know voters in recent polls have said they would prefer an economy overwhelmingly under former President Trump. So certainly at least the public numbers and some of those anecdotes are not in the president's favor here.
And that is where the pressure points lie, Kayla. There's no doubt about that. Allie, let me go back to you, because the other big story, and there are about 5 you're covering on the Hill today, is the return of Senator Feinstein. Talk about the significance, the reception she's getting, because some of her Democratic colleagues were calling on her to resign, expressing concerns that her absence was holding up the Biden agenda and judicial nominations.
Well, look, that was a pretty valid concern, especially because we were able to see the Judiciary Committee move on some nominees, but not some of the more contentious ones that would have required all 11 Democrats to be sitting on the Judiciary Committee. With Feinstein out, that was not able to happen. And so now that she is back in this building, there is a sigh of relief just from being able to do the math and do the numbers perspective. Feinstein being back at work also alleviates some of the pressure that might be coming from her back home in California, but also just from other lawmakers here in Washington who say that if she were continued to be out of Washington, that she should consider resigning her post. Now, we know that this is going to be her last term serving as the senior senator from California, but nevertheless, the continued absence was spurring even more concerns about whether or not she'd even be able to finish or even should be able to finish the term. So good news that Feinstein is back. You see her there meeting with Majority Leader Chuck Schumer as she arrived in that wheelchair there, saying it was good to be back. She was feeling better, but we can imagine that she's going to be taking a little bit of a lighter schedule here. But nevertheless, she voted today as soon as she got back to the floor, and we do expect to see her in the Judiciary Committee tomorrow, where her absence was missed.
All right. Thank you so much, Kayla and Allie, for covering all of the angles for us, for getting us started on a very busy Wednesday. Really appreciate it. We want to turn now to the border as officials prepare for Title 42 to end on Thursday. NBC's Julia Ainsley is near the border in El Paso, Texas.
Kristen, I'm here in El Paso, Texas, along the border. Just behind me is Juarez, where hundreds of migrants have lined up to come into the United States. Now, this is before Title 42 lifts. That's late tomorrow night. But already, Border Patrol has encountered over 11,000 migrants crossing just yesterday. That's well beyond the 10,000 expectation border officials told Congress they would expect when Title 42 would lift. Now, what they're trying to do to try to alleviate some of the problems here is to reduce overcrowding in Border Patrol and in cities like this in El Paso. We learned today, and NBC News was first to report, that Border Patrol is now weighing a plan, and they're planning to put this into place very soon, where they will instruct Border Patrol in their processing centers to release migrants without a court date and without a way to track them. In the past, they have released some migrants without court dates, telling them to appear at an ICE office for a court date. But in the past, they've had a way to check in, either through a geolocator like an ankle monitor or on an app. Now, in an effort to try to release as many people as possible and reduce overcrowding, we understand they'll be releasing them even without that method. So there really will be no way to track them, honestly, kind of like having them on an honor system. Secretary Mayorkas was asked about this today at a press conference. He said that these people would be well vetted and it would only affect a tiny fraction of people. Sources I've spoken to say the numbers really depend on how many numbers they get and how much they need to alleviate. At the same time, though, they're going to make applying for asylum harder in the U.S. They want to raise the bar, and they have announced a new plan where any migrant who crosses through a country on their way here where they could claim asylum, like Mexico, for example, and they don't claim asylum, that would make them ineligible to claim asylum when they get to the United States. They're also opening up more processing centers starting in countries like Colombia and Guatemala, where migrants could apply for protection from the U.S. without leaving their home countries. This is all part of a number of options the Biden administration is throwing at this major border problem as they try to accommodate and prepare for what could be a record-breaking surge when Title 42 lifts.
All eyes will be on the border, that's for sure. Thanks to Julia Ainsley for that great reporting. The common theme on both the debt ceiling and the border crisis is that they require a concerted effort from both the Democratic White House and a Republican House of Representatives to make a real breakthrough. But like a lot of things in Washington, that may be easier said than done. Is Ohio Republican Congressman David Joyce. Congressman Joyce, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be on with you, Kristen.
So I want to get your take on yesterday's high-stakes meeting at the White House. You had Speaker McCarthy, President Biden coming out, basically taking jabs at each other, a whole lot of fireworks. Both sides seemed as dug in as when they went into the meeting. What was your takeaway, and how concerned are you right now that the country could be headed for a default?
Oh, I believe that as you know, here in D.C., there's a lot of hand-tying and worry that takes place. But it is about as productive as a first meeting as you're going to have, where everybody has a standoff. But right now, the bill that we passed is the only bill in town. And it's the only game in town. And we're just waiting for the White House and for the Senate especially the Senate, to come up with something different or something better. I mean, we're amenable to any discussion, and certainly Speaker McCarthy is as well. But what we passed out there is certainly something that everyone can easily understand.
I want to ask you about the bill that you passed in just a moment, but I do want to ask you a little bit more about what we understand happened in that meeting. According to Senator Schumer, Speaker McCarthy was the only one in the meeting yesterday who would not commit to taking a default off of the table. Your reaction to that, and do you think that the hardline members in your caucus risk pushing him too far?
No, I don't believe so. One thing that has been very good about what we witnessed in November and December and the first couple of days of January before Kevin became the Speaker was a consensus that he's now put in place and putting all the people at the table, like he's called his 5 families. And so we meet on a regular basis now and discuss and work through what it was going to be and the policies and plans that went into this bill. And I think it's important that we continue to do that moving forward. And right now we put out something that we all agree is workable, but realize that now it's up to the Senate or the White House to come back with something different. And once they do, once they start to put together something, then we can have a good faith negotiation. But at the moment, ours is the only bill and plan in town, and we're going to continue down that road. So asking us to negotiate against ourselves really isn't a good idea.
But Congressman Joyce, what do you make of the fact that he wouldn't take a default off the table? How concerned are you by hearing that?
Well, you know, one thing about America is we're strong and we won't default on our debt. I get that. But we also need to control our spending. And it's very straightforward things that we were asking for in order to control our spending. And certainly Senator Biden, now Vice President Biden, and now President Biden have been down this road before. And they know that this is the time to have those discussions. And so we have to have a date set certain. You notice, I don't think anybody in this town expected us to pass the bill. We passed the bill. And then all of a sudden the sky is falling. We're going to cut this agency, we're going to cut that agency. The date all of a sudden moved up from mid-July to June 1st. I think they're trying to apply panic where panic doesn't exist at the moment.
Let me ask you about what's in the bill, because as you know, in that meeting yesterday, there was a lot of back and forth. Speaker McCarthy acknowledging that he said that it was a lie that the GOP wanted to cut veterans' benefits. The president's essentially saying, if you want to cut discretionary spending, it has to come from somewhere. So if it's not coming from veterans' benefits, which, by the way, is the second largest pot to cut from, where's it coming from? Where are the cuts coming from?
Well, you'll see when we put together our appropriations bills, but for the most part, there's nothing in this bill.
Can you respond to the president who said, how can you negotiate with we'll see, that there need to be specifics?
You're making a good point, Kristen, but there's nothing. There's absolutely no language in the bill that says we're cutting veterans' benefits. There's nothing in this bill that says we were going to rescind the Butch Lee Act that fixed the pension system for many of our union workers. Yet, those lies have been being told, and that somehow that we want to crash up against the debt limit. All we did was put out a good faith first offer, and we're waiting for the White House and the master negotiator that President Biden said he is to come to the table and start talking in specifics with Kevin, and then he can come back to the rest of us and we can make a deal accordingly.
We did hear something that perked our ears up yesterday from the president. He seemed to open the door to the possibility of supporting clawing back unspent COVID funds and also the possibility of energy permitting reform. Are those two areas of potential compromise for you?
They're great first steps. And I think that's important that he finally came to the table and started to negotiate because the American people want him to negotiate. I mean, the only one who gets her way all the time is Mrs. Joyce. I mean, let's be real. You have to negotiate. Life is about negotiations. And so those are two good steps in the right direction. And now he has to talk about a little more about the spending plans going forward. But the clawback provision is a good start for it because there's a lot of money that's been put out there in the system that hasn't been spent and needs to be reallocated back to the Treasury.
Before we move on to some other topics, would you support a short-term extension of the debt limit that lined up with the appropriations process, for example, in the fall and allowed you to essentially do both along parallel tracks so you could both declare victory, in essence?
Well, I think it's premature to discuss that right now, Kristen, because while the president has made some statements that this might be available or he would consider some of these things, and those are great first steps, we need to get down to brass tacks. And if they thought it was such an urgent a reason to meet yesterday, then why aren't they meeting today or tomorrow or continue to meet until June 1st, if that's truly the deadline? I'm here. I was willing to stay here and sacrifice my weekends and holidays and everything else to make this happen. And the rest of us stand united in doing that, too.
They are going to meet Friday, though, and we understand that staffers have been meeting every day. Is that not a sign of, and I grant you, measured progress, a baby step at least?
Sure, but, and I love staffers. They make this place work. But the authority, the positions have to come from above. And you have to know what you can negotiate on. And so there has to be things on the table to work the mechanics out.
All right, let me turn to politics, if I might. As you know, a jury yesterday found former President Trump liable of sexual assault. Do you think that the former president has the character to serve another term in office as president?
Look, I think that the system will work out and that they will have primaries, and there's going to be a number of candidates in these primaries. The field is not set, and President Trump will be one of many. But I believe this time around it's not going to be quite as unique as it was in 2016 for him. And there are a lot of things like yesterday's verdict that he's going to have to account to the American people for.
Does he have your support at this point in time?
I will support whoever the Republican nominee is, but right now it's not anybody in particular because the field has not been filled out.
You know, it's interesting. Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville said that verdict makes him want to vote for Trump twice. And I guess that makes me think about the primary versus the general. Mm-hmm. Do you think that former President Trump, yes, he may be emboldened in some quarters of the Republican Party in a primary, but is he electable in a general election, do you think?
Look, the American people are very smart. I don't think we give them enough credit. And they'll be able to see through this. And when we get down to the primaries, there are going to be some tough questions asked. I mean, I know when I go into town, people, they're pretty good about asking me the questions they want to ask me when they see me in the supermarket or at Home Depot or working out in the morning. So I don't imagine they're going to be shy, and especially something as important as a presidential debate in a presidential election. I mean, I'd like to see some of the new young people get involved in the system because I think there's some great people out there, great candidates that have been talking about running, and I look forward to an energetic debate.
All right, and Congressman, finally, I know you're on the House Ethics Committee, but your Republican colleague, George Santos, was indicted by federal prosecutors today on fraud charges. He has pleaded not guilty. Do you have confidence in him as a colleague?
Well, I cannot comment on the specifics of his case because I'm on the Ethics Committee, and so any matter that might be coming before ethics obviously is something that I just can't comment on. But I would say that the historical precedent here has been, whether it was Jeff Fortenberry, once he was indicted, he lost his committee assignments. Santos doesn't have any committee assignments. Or, Senator Menendez, who lost his committee assignments, went on to trial and was acquitted. We allow the system to run its course and give everybody an equal opportunity in this country. And, Santos is at least deserving of that.
All right, Congressman David Joyce, you covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Kristen. Thanks for having me.
And coming up, the Democratic response. We'll speak with a member from the other side of the aisle about the crisis response from the White House as an unpopular president faces challenges at the border and at the negotiating table. Plus, arrested and arraigned, disgraced Congressman George Santos is back in New York to face an array of criminal charges, fraud, money laundering, false statements, and more. The latest from the courthouse ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As we've been reporting, the clock is ticking in Washington on a pair of deadlines. In less than 36 hours, Title 42 will lift, and thousands of additional migrants are expected to cross the southern border. President Biden is warning the situation may be chaotic, and Republicans and Democrats are still far apart from any kind of a deal to raise the nation's debt ceiling and avert financial calamity, which Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warns could happen as soon as June 1st. Joining me now is Ohio Democratic Congressman Greg Landsman. Congressman Landsman, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start off by asking you the same question I asked your colleague, Congressman Joyce, which is your impressions from yesterday's meeting. We saw basically a lot of shots fired coming out of that meeting, both sides accusing the other of being over the top. Do you think any progress was made in that meeting?
Well, it's not clear, but I do believe it's important for everyone to appreciate that default cannot be an option. It would be catastrophic. The Council of Economic Advisors has said we're talking about, the potential of a 10% unemployment fiasco. Millions of people would lose their jobs. This is absolutely dangerous, and it requires everyone, certainly the key principals, to essentially lock themselves in a room until they get a resolution. So that's option one, is just when they meet this Friday, just stay at the White House, pack a bag.
Just stay there.
Yeah, just
Don't
pack a
leave
bag until there's a deal. That's option one. Option two is that there are 74 members of Congress, 32 Democrats, 32 Republicans, that have signed off on a framework, a plan, that we could pass next week to get us out of this. And then third, you could have 5 Republicans join the Democrats to just go ahead and suspend the debt ceiling.
Well, let's talk about what we heard and the possible solutions that seem to be coming to the surface. I want to play you a little bit of what President Biden had to say when he was asked about whether he would support clawbacks for unspent COVID funds. Take a look.
The answer is I'd take a hard look at it, because there's still, we don't need it all, but the question is what obligations were there made, commitments made, the money not dispersed, et cetera. I have to take a hard look at it. So it's on the table.
This was really the first time we heard President Biden suggest he's open to negotiating. Should he negotiate?
Yeah, I have been one of those folks saying for some time now that sitting down is always a good idea. People should always talk, especially when it comes to something as significant as this. We cannot default on our loans, and so having this on the table and any number of other things is productive, and we just have to get it done.
And would you support clawing back
Sure.
unspent COVID funds? That's an area of common ground. Where are the other areas of potential common ground for you? Are work requirements, for example, an area that you could potentially support?
I think at this point, we all have to be open to whatever they come back with. And so my hope is that they really do just say, hey, we're going to lock ourselves in a room here, close the doors, we're going to just keep talking until we get a resolution. And the sooner the better, because the markets are obviously very concerned, as they should be. And like I said, there's the other option, which is to take what we as the Problem Solvers Caucus put together. It's a framework that just says we're going to lift the debt ceiling. We're going to have this commission. We'll have some fiscal controls and some budget reforms, and we can pass that. And that is 74 members of Congress, 32 Democrats, 32 Republicans.
Well, look, the president put the possibility on the table that he would potentially cancel his trip to Japan for the G7 summit. Do you think he should do that, or are you concerned about the message that might send?
No, he should do whatever it takes to avoid default. We cannot default on our loans.
Would you sign a short-term deal? Something that, for example, goes through the fall? Yeah. So your position is basically anything it takes, even if the president invoked the 14th Amendment, which we were surprised to hear him lean into yesterday. He kind of leaned into it and then also talked about how complicated it would be. But were you surprised to hear him say that? Should he invoke the 14th Amendment if it comes down to that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think whatever it takes, we just, default is not an option. I mean, the global economy will fall apart. Can you imagine unemployment skyrocketing to 10%? Millions of people that we know, friends, family members, lose their jobs. So the cost of everything would go up significantly. Your house payment, your rent, your car payment. I mean, it would be catastrophic.
Given everything that you're saying as we sit here today, do you think President Biden is doing enough to get a resolution to this?
Yeah, I think the president is leading on this. We do need, this is the 11th hour, so
Even though he hasn't met with Speaker McCarthy since February?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for them to get on a new trajectory where they are meeting every week because let's say we get through this, and we will, we have to. We then have to get to a balanced budget. We need comprehensive immigration reform. We need to tackle gun violence and keep our children safe. All of that requires them working together nonstop.
Let me ask you about Title 42. As I said at the top, it's going to lift tomorrow night. President Biden said that it will be chaotic at the border for a little while. What did you make of that? Is that an acceptable comment for the president to be making on the eve of Title 42 to be lifted? Does it signal that they're not prepared?
Well, I suspect he's just being honest that it is a very difficult situation, and it does require ultimately a very similar approach. We got to lock folks in a room until we get comprehensive immigration reform. We need more folks at the border. That's officers, but we also need more judges. We need to expand the personnel down there so that we can process folks more quickly that are supposed to be here and have the resources to send folks who aren't back home.
Does the administration need to act with more urgency ahead of this deadline?
I believe that everybody does. I mean, again, this is where we need all of our leaders, especially these key principals, to say, hey, we're just going to, you know, we're all in this together. So, yes, we are going to negotiate until we have a comprehensive plan for the border.
Let me ask you about some of these polls that got the attention of the White House, Democrats and Republicans alike. Basically, a new Washington Post poll has the president trailing both Trump and DeSantis among all voters. What do you make of that poll? Are alarm bells going off within the Democratic Party?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's one of those things where some polls are good, some polls are bad. I mean, I saw another poll today that suggested that he was above water and beating both of them. So, you know, you just have to appreciate that these things go up and down. The best way to get your numbers up for all of these folks is get things done. So get this thing solved and behind us.
And you're right, it is still early, but just to put a fine point on it, do you think that President Biden is the strongest person, the best person to represent the Democratic Party in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I think that voters are categorically against the chaos and extremism that they've seen with Trump and other folks. There are very few people who better represent sort of team normal, team results, team freedom than Joe Biden.
All right, Congressman Landsman, thank you so much. Thanks for being here in person. Really good to see you. Appreciate it. Yeah. Coming up next, fraud, money laundering, theft, and false statements. Congressman George Santos appears in court for the first time to face a litany of criminal charges amid renewed pressure to step aside. We're live outside the courthouse next. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
There's a mic stand.
Welcome back. This was the scene last hour. Chaos at the courthouse in New York as disgraced New York Congressman George Santos spoke to reporters for the first time after pleading not guilty to a 13-count criminal indictment unsealed by the Justice Department this morning. As you can see, Congressman Santos could barely get to the microphones to address the charges. When he did, he remained defiant. Take a listen.
Hey, George, did you raise money for a vote?
Which I'm going to take care of clearing my name, and I look forward to doing that.
And again, you will not resign.
I will not resign. The way I look at it, I'll be a chairman of a committee in a couple of years if you just look at the standards of Congress. Look at the Senate.
The freshman congressman has been charged with wire fraud, money laundering, theft of public funds, and making false statements to the House of Representatives. Mr. Santos came under scrutiny before he was even sworn in after a bombshell New York Times investigation calling into question much of his resume. In light of the indictment, some Republican colleagues are calling on Santos to resign. But House GOP leadership, including Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise, say they are reserving judgment until the court process plays out. NBC News correspondent Valerie Castro is outside the courthouse with the very latest. So, Valerie, thanks for joining me. What more do we know about what happened inside the courtroom today?
Kristen, so we know this was a very quick court appearance. The arraignment only lasted about 11 minutes or so. As we know, George Santos pleaded not guilty to those 13 federal counts. We do know that he posted a $500,000 bond, and his attorney telling NBC News that 3 individuals were behind the surety for that bond, but they wished to remain anonymous, citing concerns of retaliation. The judge ordered George Santos to surrender his passport and says that he should limit his travel between Washington, D.C. and New York. His next court appearance is scheduled for some time in June. During all of this, Santos says he remains defiant. He will not resign. He says he does plan to run for re-election. And we should note that if he is convicted on the most serious of these federal charges, the punishment for that would be up to 20 years in prison.
Wow.
Kristen?
You know, Valerie, as I was saying at the top, there have been calls for him to resign among some of his colleagues here in D.C. But what are New Yorkers saying in his district? What are you hearing there?
Well, Kristen, members on both sides of the aisle here in New York are also calling for him to resign. 2 Republican representatives here in New York, Mike Lawler and Representative Molinaro, they've both called on him to resign. Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she says he should have resigned even before he was ever sworn in. But we should note that Representative Elise Stefanik, she is urging caution. She is saying we should let the legal process play out. So opinions on both sides of the aisle. Kristen?
All right, Valerie Castro from outside of the courthouse for us. Thank you so much for bringing us those breaking developments. We really appreciate it. After the break, new reaction from top Republicans, including an NBC News exclusive with former Vice President Mike Pence after the party's presidential frontrunner, Donald Trump, is found liable for sexual assault and defamation. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Being found liable for sexual abuse and defamation would normally be a campaign crippling event. But even after yesterday's verdict, former President Donald Trump still has a firm grasp over the Republican Party as the clear frontrunner for the presidential nomination. There are some in his party who are grappling with what the verdict could mean for his electability, though, in 2024. Take a listen.
The fact is, I do not think he can win the presidency. And so I think regardless of what you think about him as an individual, to me, electability is the sole criterion.
You don't think that Trump could be elected president again?
I don't think so.
I hope the jury of the American people reach the same conclusion about Donald Trump. He just is not suited to be president of the United States.
It's just simply a reflection of continued indefensible conduct by former President Donald Trump. That's what it means to me.
Look, this kind of conduct is unacceptable for somebody that we call a leader, and him wanting to take leadership again.
But other Republicans are trying to downplay the issue.
Yeah, I think the New York legal system's off the rails when it comes to Donald Trump.
I don't think it's going to make a difference. I don't think it's going to make a difference to Trump supporters or Trump's opponents.
That's something for Trump to respond to. You know, I mean, I think the focus has to be not to be distracted. It's why we've got to leave the baggage and the negativity behind.
It's just one more story focusing on my former running mate that I know is a great fascination to members of the national media, but I just don't think it's where the American people are focused. In my 4.5 years serving alongside the president, I never heard or witnessed behavior of that nature.
Now, that last clip was from my NBC colleague Dasha Burns' exclusive interview with former Vice President Mike Pence. And Dasha joins us now. Dasha, congratulations on a really great newsmaking interview. You know, it's interesting because the former president has, of course, railed against his former vice president. The former vice president has had some really strong words for Mr. Trump, particularly around January 6th. So what did you make of what we heard from him yesterday on this issue?
Well, look, Kristen, this is sort of a prime example of the challenge that any current or potential Republican candidate in 2024 is facing here. And by the way, the former vice president tells us that he will be announcing that decision by the end of June, whether or not he's going to throw his hat in the ring there. But at the end of the day, all of these candidates, potential candidates, are going to be having to answer questions about the latest thing that Donald Trump said or did or has been accused of saying or doing. And the former vice president is no stranger to being in that seat and being asked these kinds of questions. And so when that verdict, news of that verdict broke just a couple of hours before we sat down, my question was, what is he going to do here? Is he going to take this opportunity to either criticize or at least potentially distance himself from his former boss, to denounce sexual abuse at the very least? Or is he going to, dodge or potentially defend his former boss? And you heard how he handled that there. So it's interesting to see him once again sort of stand by his former boss. The only time you've really seen very much daylight between the two of them is what you mentioned there with January 6th, Kristen.
Yeah, it is so fascinating, and we're going to look to the debates as a potential opportunity for the gloves to possibly come off with some of his rivals. We'll have to see if that happens and if the former vice president gets into the race. But I know you asked Mr. Pence about the big battle here in Washington, the fight over the debt ceiling. What did he have to say about that, Dasha?
Well, that was actually one of the few moments where he departed a little bit from former President Trump. When I pressed him about the debt rising under the Trump-Pence administration of almost $7.8 trillion, much of that pre-pandemic, by the way. Take a listen to what he said.
The trillions of dollars that we appropriated for families and businesses and health care in this country during COVID it's what government's for during a time of national emergency. But let me stipulate, Dasha, we could have done a better job controlling spending under our administration. We could have taken on entitlement reform during our administration.
He did say he stands with Kevin McCarthy in the way he's handling this, but entitlement reform, that is one area where he departs from some of his peers in the Republican Party, Kristen.
Fascinating interview. Dasha Burns, thank you for your great reporting as always. Really appreciate it and good to see you. A deeper dive into the fallout facing Trump as the 2024 primary season ramps up after a quick break. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Former President Trump's latest legal issues aren't his first, and they won't be his last. He faces a slew of cases, both civil and criminal, with several possibly heading to trial or appeals during the 2024 primary season. But despite some hand-wringing from those in his party, his friends and foes seem to agree there's hardly any legal outcome that could jeopardize his status as Republican presidential frontrunner. Joining me now to discuss this is our panel: Eugene Scott, senior politics reporter at Axios; Stephanie Shriak, senior advisor at the Strategic Victory Fund; and Jim Garrity, National Review senior political correspondent and a Washington Post contributing columnist. Thanks to all of you for being here. Eugene, let me start with you and just have you set the table here. What is the impact of this civil case? E. Jean Carroll essentially winning yesterday, a jury finding the former president liable for sexual abuse, although not rape.
Well, the impact of it politically is that we now know that the former president is going to have to campaign and answer questions for this after years of denying this and accusing everyone of lying, and knowing that a jury of his peers did not see it that way. I think a really interesting impact of it beyond this case is this Adult Survivors Act is probably going to lead to more cases like this being opened up, even possibly against Donald Trump.
Jim, what was your reaction?
My reaction was, here we go again with Access Hollywood. In fact, that Access Hollywood tape was a really revealing moment in this trial, where during the deposition that Trump had said, he said, well, you know, stars have gotten away with this, unfortunately or fortunately. And I think I just, did a spit take saying, fortunately, please explain to me how that's the upside of that. But look, almost everyone I talked to today, if they voted for Trump before, they found a way to excuse it, hand wave it away. Oh, those New York juries and all that stuff. I don't think in a general election, the entire country is going to be like, oh, okay, yeah, people get, these kinds of verdicts against them all the time. $5 million, oh, it's no big deal. That's in the general election, that's not going to be as big a deal.
Well, and I think it's a great point. John Cornyn, Senator Cornyn, said something similar, Stephanie. He said he doesn't think Trump could win the presidency because of general election electability. Mm-hmm. Do you think it's too early to say that? I mean, Jim is saying in a general election, it's not going to play as well as a primary per se.
Well, I think that is true, but you cannot ignore the strength of Trump's ability to really drive up turnout across this country in key battleground states. So I always warn my Democratic colleagues, hey, we cannot take this guy for granted. We did that once. We can't ever do it again. But this is a very, very serious issue, particularly among a very key part of the electorate, which are swing women voters, and particularly the suburbs. And then you add the Dobbs decision and access to abortion, and you've got a real big problem entirely for the Republican Party, and it's just compiling itself.
Yeah, I mean, Eugene, are you surprised that more Republican candidates have not come forward, save Asa Hutchinson, and use this moment to try to point out the differences between themselves and the former president?
I'm not surprised, only because they've been consistent in approaching Donald Trump that way since announcing their campaigns. They really do not want to piss off Trump voters because, as we've noted, they're an incredibly loyal and faithful bloc. And if you're trying to convince them to back you, attacking him doesn't seem to work. It didn't work in 2016, and they don't think it'll work now.
You know, I saw during the indictment in New York, these conversations that I had with Republican sources who said at some point the gloves are going to come off. I'm not sure, Jim. What do you think? I mean, when the debates roll around in August, do you think that's a moment? Or do you say, no, they're going to stick to their, where they are right now?
At least two of these candidates certainly look and sound like they're running to be vice president. So on that debate stage for Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy, when the gloves come off, it's because Donald Trump's hands are cold and they want to make up and warm up there. DeSantis maybe, and that's maybe the million-dollar question of this whole debate.
Yeah,
Does DeSantis get up there, get in his face, or conceivably Chris Christie keeps acting or sounding like he wants to run just to go on that debate stage and rip into Trump to his face just to see how he reacts?
Yeah. Stephanie.
Well, I just guess we expect that to happen. And if you want to win a presidential race in this country, you have got to show the voters that you are willing to fight. That is why he won that primary to begin. He didn't start in the lead in 2015. People forget that he started way down and he fought to get that nomination. Yeah. So if somebody wants to beat him in this primary, they're going to have to fight for it. And I've not seen it. I've not seen it the entire time because they're afraid of that base. But you know about that base? They want to see a fighter. And I don't know if they've got one in there outside of him.
And we're going to see him tonight for the first time in a town hall, really since the last presidential cycle. Eugene, what are you going to be watching for tonight? I mean, obviously this latest case will come up, but what will you be watching for from Mr. Trump?
Well, I want to know if he's going to answer any questions about this. The crowd will be Republicans or Republican-leaning voters, and I wonder if any of them are going to bring this up and if he is going to figure out some type of response to it besides she's lying and this is a witch hunt. History has proven that he probably will not, but he may have to answer to voters in a way that he usually doesn't like to answer to the press, and so I think that will be interesting.
All right, let's turn to the big battle here brewing in Washington that has been consuming so much of everyone's energy at this table, I am sure. Stephanie, what were your takeaways from that meeting yesterday at the White House? You saw both sides come up. They started taking, punches at each other. I mean, it didn't seem like there was any progress, and yet staffers met today. They're going to meet tomorrow. Right. And we know that the principals are going to be back at the White House on Friday.
I mean, I think truly everybody knows this is a very serious situation. I mean, maybe there's a little argument in the press about it, and they'll like, no, they all know this is the world's economy, and they've got to figure this out. So you're going to see them, I believe, sitting in a locked room until they figure it out. Now, I was Senator John Tester's chief of staff the last time we went through this, and I remember, like, day by day, it felt exactly the same way. And you just have to figure this thing out. And it's unfortunate that we're dealing with it. We just have to, I think, figure out a solution in the long run to this debt ceiling issue.
Jim, how do you see this ending? Congressman Landsman notably said they should literally stay in a room, stay in the Oval Office till they figure
We'll know it's really getting real when the Senate stays in session and or Biden cancels his trip to Asia and Australia. Obviously, he can sign legislation wherever he is, but generally that's a good sign. Look, in a game of chicken, if you crash, both sides lose. Right. So the only way you're going to do this, so in the end, I suspect, there's no way like, well, we tanked the economy, things went bad, but they got 51% of the blame, so we won that conflict.
Right. Eugene, where's the off-ramp here? Because I've been talking to my sources. There was talk of a short-term, possibly solution, but now you have McCarthy saying he doesn't want that, the president publicly saying he doesn't want that. How does this end based on your reporting right now?
I was on the Hill earlier talking to some lawmakers, and they don't know as of now, but I think all eyes should be on the Problem Solvers Caucus. It's a caucus that consists of Democrats and Republicans that are really committed to trying to figure out a solution to this problem. And it's these individuals who understand the severity of what actually may happen.
Are you surprised we're not seeing more from McConnell? I mean, he's the guy who knows how to get in the room and make a deal on these types of moments.
I think what he really is trying to do is make it clear that this is something primarily between McCarthy and the president. And he's been very vocal, towing the party line in terms of saying Biden needs to negotiate and making sure that he's, of course, criticizing the right person. But this ultimately is between the House leader and the president.
I was surprised that we heard the president yesterday not take the 14th Amendment off the table. What do you think would be the impact of that?
It is interesting. I was honestly a little surprised too, but I think this is the seriousness of this whole operation right now. And I also say on the McConnell point, I kind of get it. This is a moment that Speaker McCarthy has either got to deliver it, or he is in deep trouble. Because his future is very much on the line in this whole situation, too.
Yeah, I think it is not overstated to say both Speaker McCarthy and President Biden's jobs are on the line with this one. Thank you all. I wish we had more time. But that is all the time we have for now. Thanks for being with here. And thank you for being with us this hour. I'm back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.